Thank you so much for joining us. I was just waiting for that pause there to make sure we're recording. So all this will be available to you following today's webinar. Again, my name is Patrice Peterson. I work in the Office of Consumer Affairs within New York City Department of Health and Mental Hygiene. And you are now entering into Trauma in the Workplace. This is webinar 3. Our final webinar of the series. And again, you can catch those recordings of the previous webinars if you so choose. Who we are. Today we are joined by Kathy Cave. She is the Senior Training Consultant at the National Center on Domestic Violence, Trauma, and Mental Health. Also presenting today is Helen Skipper. She is the Executive Director of the New York City Justice Peer Initiative. Next, we have Tina Brooks, also within the Office of Consumer Affairs. She is the Assistant Director there at New York City Department of Health and Mental Hygiene. Again, you see myself on the slide, also representing the New York City Consortium for Peers and Community Health Workers. Rita Cronice, we're collaborating with through this for this webinar series as well. She represents PeerTech at the Academy of Peer Services in Rutgers University. We also have Miriam in the chat representing NIAPRIS and the Academy of Peer Services. She'll be taking on your questions and concerns, so feel free to type those in. And lastly, we want to also recognize contributions from Laverne Miller. She was very instrumental in us putting this together and did a lot of the consulting work as well. So, how and why we are here? We are here because trauma, I'll start off by saying the word trauma gets thrown around a lot, but we are really here to make sure that when it is thrown out and when it is suggested, that people really have a solid understanding of what trauma really entails. So we went over that more so in the first webinar where we gave definitions and scenarios and things of that nature. But why we are here really today is to provide a safe space for all of you as peers, as allies within the peer movement, to really give you a space to express yourself. And so feel free to use the chat. And aside from expressing yourself, we don't just mean like without any direction. We want to give you structure. We want to give you focus and really just make this a positive example of how we can grow through our trauma and get on the other side of post-traumatic growth. So that's pretty much how and why we are here today in a nutshell. I'm going to start off with some self-awareness and invite you to become self-aware and engage in that as a self-care practice right now. I really love this quote. This was from our first webinar, and it's from Sherry Mead, and I'll read it through. It's, "In the thick of this work, we often forget about our own needs until they are so big we can no longer meet them in simple ways." And this quote really struck me and felt applicable to today's webinar topic for me and my experience, my lived experience, because I feel that I wasn't aware of my needs, and that didn't lead to the trauma per se, but it definitely was a contributor. I was, really wanting a job in the height of COVID and not really in touch with my needs of an employer and of the workplace. And I just went into a situation that ended up being very toxic for me and very much a traumatic experience, for lack of a better word. So I just wanted to bring this point up today and say that it's very important that we remain self-aware and that we take time for that self-care and self-awareness to really figure out what are our needs so we don't find ourselves in situations that sometimes aren't preventable. Sometimes these workplaces just aren't set up to meet us where we are. That is true, but it is our responsibility to really understand our own needs and wants and desires for the workplace and for a work circumstance. The workplace scene that I was in really was mismanaged. And we talk about that a lot within the peer workforce, particularly around integrating peers effectively into the workplace. So we are definitely working on that at the Office of Consumer Affairs, figuring out how we can get these workplaces ready to receive peers in a more positive stance. So my experience has motivated me even more. I'm grateful to say that today I am in a very healthy and helpful workplace, and it has also deepened my self-awareness journey. And I'm just going to leave it at that and say, continue to be self-aware and take that time for self-care. And I'm going to pass it on to Kathy.
Good morning, everyone. Patrice, thank you so much. And for us to really begin our time together with a way of, again, sharing practices that help us to co-regulate. Co-regulation, particularly in the workplace, can be helpful in that it's what peer support's all about. What is at the heart of the work we do and the support we offer each other is being able to navigate when we're not feeling grounded and centered, to be able to offer each other mind-body practices that can help in the moment to do this co-regulation, which is grounding, calming, centering ourselves, and doing that with other people. So I wanted to share, excuse me, a really brief activity that is easy to do, easy to share. In our bodies, we have pressure points that are really helpful to notice and name. And so to be next to another person, we don't have to touch each other, but to encourage folks to find those points themselves. So as Patrice was talking, I actually found myself noticing this point on my wrist. So right at the base of your palm on your wrist, there's a point there that I wasn't really thinking about as Patrice was talking. And then I noticed that I was actually rubbing it. So if you take your fingertips and actually apply some pressure and give yourself a moment to just breathe, something that you could model, sit next to someone else, offer that, and just apply that pressure. Consider what's happening. Consider the need to get centered, to focus, or to not focus, whatever works for you, and apply that pressure. You also have similar points on at your temples. So again, using fingertips to rub those spaces along your hairline, rubbing those spaces. On the back of your neck at your hairline, rubbing those spaces, and just giving yourself a moment to breathe, to get connected to yourself, and to support people to connect to themselves. Again, and to do this in a way that's really honest, really transparent, that names what you're doing and why you're doing it and how it helps. Rita, I'm going to invite you to go ahead and launch the poll for us. If folks would go ahead and respond to the poll so that we can get a sense of who's here and what folks are doing. Thank you all for being so responsive. We can see it filling right up. Really appreciate that. Just helps us to know who's in the room with us, helps with our data collection, helps support what folks need and what you find helpful in these conversations. So thank you so much. And while folks are finishing up the poll, I wanted to go ahead and spend a little bit of time with where we've been on this journey. So we really intended in this webinar series to focus in on trauma that occurs in the workplace. And we talked about in our first webinar about how, trauma impacts all of us. It's not something that some of us are exposed to and some of us are not. We're all exposed to stressful circumstances, and some of us may be traumatized by those experiences, and some of us not. So really taking the time to notice that in your workplace, people around you may be experiencing trauma responses, and that source of that trauma could be a number of places. And so the number of places includes experience with childhood trauma, experience with hate crimes, experiences with community trauma, experience with trauma that happens in the workplace. And we had a really good discussion in webinar 2 about often how the sources of trauma are connected to identity, that there are experiences that are historical, for example, genocide, things that have happened with enslavement of Africans in this country, experiences with immigration, and how those early experiences and generational experiences can impact us today by having trauma reminders, things that actually call up those experiences. I had an experience just a week ago when I was trying to rent a car, and it was, if you were on the outside looking in, it just seemed like a pretty neutral thing. But there was a comment that was made to me by the person who was on the other side of the counter that brought up all of these deep feelings. And I was angry and frustrated. And so at what point in the day that as a woman of color, I have another reminder of who I am, how I look, how I'm showing up, and that judgment that's attached to it, and the discrimination that is often attached to it. And so recognizing that this does happen in the workplace, that we've shared resources in this series, we've shared information in this series, how because of identity, we can be othered, marginalized, and prevented from having access to resources based on being a person in recovery, based on being a person who's healing, based on being a person who is part of a marginalized group and identifies with that group. So whether we're talking about sexual orientation, whether we're talking about race or language or spirituality, all of the ways that people are othered, and then the workplace makes those things worse. So when we talk about ways to support each other and ways to show up, really important to think about that in our workplaces, and there was something, Patrice, that you said around, really needing to meet people where they truly are rather than where we wish they were, is the piece that I would add to that. And so thinking about safety in terms of physical safety and emotional safety, and the ways that we are showing up and supporting one another, that our workplaces are either helping us or limiting the ways that we can show up. So wanting us to really be mindful that workplace trauma is real, that there are challenges for us, and thinking about how we can be better. I'm actually going to ask for some support because I don't know how to move the poll that is up. And if there's anyone who can help with that, that would be awesome. Because right now, I'm in the middle of my screen.
Should be sharing the results now. Is that what you're seeing?
There's a button to click that says share results, and then it says stop sharing. But when I click either of those, nothing happens. It's
Okay.
still present.
Gone now?
Nope.
No. Okay.
I found it, was able to make it go away. Thank you so much for the support. All right. So today in our time, we're going to have some continued sharing of experiences. Again, Patrice, thank you so much for your sharing. We have others that are going to contribute to our conversation today. We're going to consider the qualities of a workplace that really does strive to be accessible, culturally responsive, and trauma-informed. So at the National Center for Domestic Violence, Trauma, and Mental Health, one of the things we talk about is being trauma-informed isn't only about being trauma-informed. It's also about being healing-informed. It's also about thinking about access and how to be culturally responsive so that everyone feels that sense of belonging. And we also intend to explore some resources that can support transformation and sustainable action and change. So I am going to turn this over to Mariam for some sharing.
Hi, good morning. Thank you so much. So I'm going to do a small talk on a section of peers that I call invisible ones. That's a coined phrase I've come up with for people who I think, like me, don't have the face of what folks think a person with trauma or mental challenges or other, what we look like. I've had often people say, you don't look like you need anything. And I had to ask, what does that look like? What does that actually look like? So I'm going to take you just through a little bit of who I am, what makes me me, and then kind of come into where this really bridges itself out to why it's so important to not put the face on a person that has trauma and learn to ask those kind of questions. So a little bit about myself. I identify as a Puerto Rican Cherokee woman from the South. My mom is from the South. My dad is from Ponce. I am the youngest of 6 children. I became fatherless at 5 as a result of alcohol abuse and my dad's passing. I also began to experience molestation, as far as I can remember, at 5 years old. I had my first rape experience at 13. Multiple different bouts of domestic violence. And I was taught not to speak up, to talk back. Stop was not an allowed word in my house. Thus, depression, suicide, and anxiety became how I functioned and how I lived. I learned to be what I call a chameleon. You can see me and I function and I look great and I move around town with all of the energy of a socialite. People used to say, oh, you're so sociable. No, I'm really not. But the inside is a whole nother person. I started this particular job that I want to mention in 2000, and it was a job funded by the AIDS Institute, the CDC, and DOH. And it was targeted high-risk pregnant women. And these women have many categories: adolescent immigrants, substance abusers, HIV positive, formerly incarcerated, mentally ill, and any combination of that. And I service 13 zip codes in Harlem, Washington Heights, and Northern Manhattan, which is where I'm originally from. There was 2 people on this team, myself and my director. So we were given the task to literally create this program from a document, a thought on a piece of paper. And I was the person who was the program associate. So I did all the field work, the footwork, the paperwork, this kind of thing. And she kind of did the budget and things like that. I eventually learned that my director had ADHD. Not that that's a problem, but she was extremely abusive. Verbally abusive. She would talk to me in ways, she would scream at me in the office. She would toss things at me. We would have meetings, supposedly staff meetings, and she would literally just get up and say, well, I got to go, use the bathroom, and literally just walk out. She challenged my educational status. She would say, oh my God, you need to go to school. You need to learn how to write. You don't do anything right. She just kept being so aggressive in this negative. She even challenged and abused me spiritually. As you can maybe not see, I am a Muslim. I've been a Muslim since I was about 15 years old. And so I didn't take lunch breaks 5 days of the week so I could have a 2-hour break for prayer on Friday. She began to challenge that. Why are you going? When are you going? What time do you have to be there? What exactly do you do? I didn't give you permission to do this, until the point that I ended up getting suspended without pay for 3 days because I would not respond to her the way she wanted me to. As a result of all of this, I had no one to reach out to because she was my immediate supervisor. There was no one above her other than my funders. I was, cordial with them, but you don't want to just go to your funders and say, hey, this is what's happening in my thing, right? So I had no support. As a result of that, I started going through physical pain and anguish. I had major muscle spasms to the point I couldn't move, I couldn't sit. I had very strong medication, which didn't work. So sometimes I was hauled over, or sometimes I was too lethargic, I couldn't get up. I was suspended multiple times. But on the top of that, my anxiety became really prevalent. My depression became more prevalent. And then I began to also feel, suicidal ideation because I just didn't understand my worth anymore because I had no one to reach out to. I went to seek counseling for my first time then. And the counselor that I saw, her first and initial and only question really to me was, why do you hate your mother? I'm like, where do you get that from? How did I say this? I don't understand. So needless to say, counseling did not work for me. And I refused to go back to see her and just had to figure out some things to make the change. So how did I find support? I literally did reach out to my funders. We met regularly. We became friends. It was a bunch of women. We became friends. And so at some point, I would literally say, hey, there's a problem here and I need your help. I began to write really nice memos and to them and they responded. I spent more time focused, of course, when I prayed to just really ask for patience and relief of these traumas that I was feeling and how I could handle them personally. I dealt with a lot of music. I listened to jazz all day. I was walking home, listening to things at my desk. I had things plugged in. So I would find very creative music that would help me find the momentum that I needed to have to function in the day. I also began to walk intentionally. When I walked home, I consciously would put on my headset and walk with the pace of, I have to release this stuff before I got home to my children. Because if I can't handle it, I have no choice but to let it spill over to my home and my children. I became more self-aware. So that brought me to where I am today, how I function and how I interact with people. If people call the academy and they need assistance, often they say, oh my God, you have the patience of Job. No, I'm not Job. I've just had my own set of experiences and traumas that no one can actually see. So if I can't be seen by them, I don't need to see you to give you what I call simple kindness, right? Some courtesy. I don't know what you're going through, but I do know if you call me, you need something. So how can I best help you? And so that's how I position myself. And that's where I've come to this place of finding peace. And that's what I call the face of the invisible ones. Thank you for listening.
Mariam, thank you so much. And I encourage everyone to please ask questions in the chat, share comments, share your responses to what you're hearing today. I really appreciated that naming that invisibility. So Mariam, thank you for that. I too have worked in organizations where one would think that we want to really support healing. We really want to name the challenges that folks experience so that we can work really intentionally on workplace practices that support and shore us up. I once, for about 7 years, worked for the New York State Office of Mental Health as the initially coordinator and later director for cultural competence. And in that role, I had a mentor in my first year. And one of the first things my mentor said to me is, look, as a woman of color, you can't ever let anyone know that you struggle with mental health challenges. Meanwhile, I was talking with folks who were deeply immersed in peer support practice and deeply as other women of color, willing to share their experiences. And that what I learned is that there was this whole community that opened up for me, to me, including me, around these are real things, these are real experiences, and we can support each other. So thank you for that sharing. Now I'm going to turn this over to Skip to share a little bit more about experience.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Mariam, for that. Thank you. It got me to wondering, and it got me to thinking. Hello, everyone. Y'all know me. My name is Skip. And if you know me, you also know that I'm directly impacted by the criminal justice system. And the story that I want to share with you today is a personal story that still affects me deeply today. But let me set the stage for you. When I came home in 2007, I still had a lot of ups and downs. Not only am I directly impacted by the criminal justice system, I am also in recovery from substance abuse. Not only am I in recovery from substance abuse, I'm also in recovery from active mental illness and dealing with a diagnosis. So when I came home from criminal justice impacts. I was just released. I went straight into a substance abuse program. Not only that, I was taken all the way out to Suffolk County in Long Island. So I went into a program. I lived in a sober house. I finished the program. I wasn't making any money like everybody else. We all went and applied for Social Security, but that took too long. In the meantime, New York City was literally paying for our lodging, our room and board. But after all was said and done, what we were left with was, and I kid you not, was $23.50 every 2 weeks. $23.50 to pay for all of our personal care needs. Our room and board was paid for. Our food stamps went to the sober house to feed us, but we had $23.50 to buy our personal care needs, transportation, and whatever else we needed. So even though we applied for Social Security, that took too long as well. I needed to get out and start working. Thank you, Kelly. I started looking for a job. Now, even though I've been going 25 years in and out of the criminal justice system, I've always worked. I have good skills, good experience. I've worked in Wall Street. I've worked as a bookkeeper. I've done some things. So I knew I could go out there and I could get a job. And that's what I did. But I was hiding. I was hiding my true self. I was hiding that I was in the early stages of recovery. So I was still trying to navigate my feelings about that. Like I was really very early in recovery, like 1 to 2 months, and anything could tick me off. Hiding the fact that I'm justice impacted, like I'm just getting released. There was no second chance hiring at that time. So no, I didn't put that on my job application. I had good references, but no one spoke to the fact that I was just released from a state facility. I got a good job. I got a good job in an area of Suffolk County where not too many people look like me, nor are there too many people that look like me work in this area. And I'm going to mention who it is because I'm unapologetic. I started working for Bender and Bender in Hauppauge, Long Island, which is upper high class neighborhood. And let me just set the stage. I told you the only money I was getting was $23.50. There was a thrift shop, a real big thrift shop. We all went to this thrift shop to buy clothes. I'm buying my clothes out of the thrift shop. So I'm already feeling a sense of otherness. I get this job. I'm going into this job. I'm wearing thrift shop clothes. I'm trying very hard to succeed at this job. I'm working as a case manager where I'm helping people apply for and get Social Security disability payments. And I get to the job and already I'm feeling like it's just me. I'm feeling like all eyes are on me. I'm looking at a bunch of people who don't look like me, who don't act like me, who don't talk like me. I'm hiding the fact that I'm in recovery. I'm hiding the fact that I'm criminal justice impacted. I've got supervisors who are talking down to me who kind of figure out that there is something different about me, but they just can't put their finger on it. Instead, they persist in talking down to me because I guess they feel like I should be one of the janitors cleaning the building and not working as a case manager. So I'm getting talked down to. I'm being talked any type of way. I'm being disrespected. I'm really being pushed to my limits. I am struggling so hard not to break. And when I say break, I'm criminal justice impacted, which means I've done some things in my lifetime. I've been in some places and spaces that these women, these upper middle class women that don't look like me have never been. And I'm struggling not to let that come out. So when you're talking to me out the side of your neck and you're being disrespectful to me, and I'm struggling not to go back to what I used to do, which is step up to you and punch you in the face because you're talking sideways to me. And I'm struggling not to do that, though I'm going in the bathroom and sitting in a stall, going between crying and wanting to jump out the stall and go grab you by the neck and fling you around like the rag doll you are. And I'm saying, okay, I need this job because this is how I'm going to move out this sober house. And people are saying, yeah, where do you live? And I'm lying about where I live. I don't want to give my exact address because it's a sober house and I don't want nobody to know that. I'm going to meetings and I don't want nobody to see me going to meetings. I'm hiding, I'm in recovery. When they talk disparagingly about people who are applying for Social Security, oh yeah, this one, I think this one just got released from jail. This one is a criminal. This one is this one is that. I'm kind of like ducking my head and trying to look the other way. It was just the face I had to put on for this job was not me. The trauma I had to endure to work at this place was not me. And every day I walked into the job, I felt like all eyes was on me. That sense of otherness just completely covered me. I never felt right. I felt like everybody was looking at me. I was paranoid. I felt like they were watching me. I did nothing right at this job. I felt like I was a minute away from being fired, which I literally was. When I picked up the phone, they were listening on the other end. They thought I was always making personal calls. I wasn't doing my cases right. I wasn't this. I just wasn't right, period. And my immediate supervisor frequently wondered to me out loud, like, why was I even employed with these people? And I just struggled to last, to garner a paycheck and just exist. And after too many episodes of me hiding in the bathroom, trying not to cry, trying not to run out and punch somebody in the face, it all came to an explosive end when finally Social Security called me and sent me a letter and say, we need you to come in for some type of, I don't know what type of appointment. I think it was a medical appointment or a psychiatric evaluation, something like that. And I had to ask for permission to take the time off. And I was categorized right then and there because when I went to, I didn't have time to take off. So I had to be real and intentional when I asked for the time to go to this appointment. And right there, I was categorized. And my supervisor said, oh, what, SSI? She put me right there in that category of not ever working, not ever paying into the Social Security system. And if we know anything about Social Security, SSI is for people who have never worked. And it's really looked down on by some people because it's considered, and this is not my thoughts, but amongst some professionals who work in Social Security, it's considered federal government welfare because you've never worked or paid into the Social Security system, whereas Social Security disability is when you have worked and paid into the Social Security system and you're now considered medically disabled and can now withdraw that money because you're considered medically disabled. So when I said I needed to take time off for a Social Security appointment, it was automatically construed that I needed time off for an SSI appointment because the thought was I could never work. Not me. Yeah, you got to go for SSI. You know, why would we think you ever paid into the Social Security system, that you ever had a real job? And that was emotionally draining. It's like you kind of like X me out of ever doing anything positive. And I just broke. And I roundly cursed out my supervisor and told her, how dare you think of me like that? Regardless of what you think of me, I have been a responsible citizen at times. I have worked. And how dare you even put that on me without even knowing what is going on with me? And to make a long story short, after I cursed her out and I cursed her boss out and literally cursed everybody out with some well thought of words and phrases that I will not repeat now because I am not a racist, but when you come at me in a racist fashion with structural and institutional racism, and you just heap more trauma upon me, I react in that fashion and walked out. But that one instance taught me a lot about the trauma that we endure and also about the trauma that is continually heaped upon us. And some of it is unconscious, some of it is subconscious, but it still persists. And this is what happens when you walk into spaces where people know nothing about being trauma informed. Now, let me just add this caveat. This happened some years ago. I have to admit that this happened before there is such a thing as second chance hiring. Moving up into present times, now that we do have such a thing as second chance hiring, I also have to say this: second chance hiring does not work if employers are not able to successfully welcome people who are directly impacted by the criminal justice system in a fashion that it does not perpetrate and continue the harm. If you are not trauma informed, you cannot successfully welcome someone who is directly impacted by the criminal justice system successfully. And I'll end my story there. Thank you, Kathy. Second chance hiring. I will answer that in the chat for those who don't know what second chance hiring is.
Go ahead, Skip.
Okay, second chance hiring is a measure that employers are using to hire those who are directly impacted by the criminal justice system. It is hiring people with the full-on knowledge that they are impacted by the criminal justice system, with the openness of knowing that they're impacted, but still willing to give people a second chance and employ them just because. So we don't hold that against them, that they are impacted by the criminal justice system. We're still willing to hire them.
Thank you so much. So I wanted
You're
to
welcome.
point out that Skip and Mariam are getting lots of love in the chat. So just pay attention and notice. And again, inviting folks to share your comments and your thoughts. You know, Skip, I really appreciate you naming how our workplaces can heap trauma on top of trauma on top of trauma. And that's been really the heart of this series, really wanting to shine a light on the ways that that happens, on the experiences that many of us have had and continue to have, and really taking the time to name, what does it mean to have a really different approach and to think about how do we transform our workplaces so they do not pile on trauma after trauma. We've experienced discrimination. We've talked about that. We've talked about the ways that stigma and assumptions continue to play out and the worries in the general public about mental health challenges and trauma. What we know, again, is that trauma is not, it only impacts you or it only impacts you. We can all be impacted. So looking for ways in our workplaces where we can focus on what's supportive, what's healing, how do we think about how to be culturally responsive? How do we make sure that we're actually having conversations with folks at work around what supports you when you feel overwhelmed? And that these are conversations for any of us, because any one of us as a human can experience a human condition of being impacted by trauma and experiencing what that looks like, what that feels like. And it may look differently for any of us. So to be able to talk about that when any of us struggles, what is it that works for us so that our workplaces can begin to accommodate diverse experience and help us all to thrive. So I am going to turn this over to Tina for sharing. And Tina Brooks, please join us in this conversation.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Kathy. And thank you, Miriam, Skip, and Patrice. So powerful to hear your stories this morning. That is my better furry half, Paxton Hamilton, you see on the screen. I love to put him in any slide that I can. Something that's really been healing for me is being able to be a pet owner and just to be able to share that sort of unconditional love that pets give you. So just wanted to share them with you this morning. Next slide. So that is me. I think I was maybe 3. It was interesting as I was listening to everyone talk. I think definitely there's some themes about, who we feel like we have permission to show up as. And I like that picture. I always joke and tell people I came from like that Black family. We were the folks in our small town who owned homes, who had property, who quote unquote did well. And it was great to grow up having opportunities, but I think the other side of that is, what does it mean to struggle, and is there really space to be able to struggle? And I definitely got a clear message early on saying that it wasn't. We've given you these opportunities, you've had this great life, and you are going to have these great opportunities, so you need to show up and be the best that you can be. And that means doing well and doing everything that people expect you to do. So that was a lot of really, I think, where I started to think about what my contribution in the world would be and how I would show up in work. One thing that did really shift my perspective is my brother was justice involved when I was younger and throughout most of my adult life. So I think that's where I really started to look at the system differently. It's a moment where you get the message that this isn't set up for you, despite what your family kind of tells you. So that really shifted my thinking and my path and my interest, I think, in a really good way. And it really speaks to where I started to go with my career. For folks who don't know me, I am a licensed social worker. I've worked in the field for, how long? About 25 years. Next slide. So I started out in doing with a real clinical focus. That's and also working in student development. I was a fellow at the University of Nevada. And those are my students from Upward Bound that I work with, my staff. When I wasn't doing that work, I also was being trained as a clinician and working with families impacted by incest and molestation at a small community-based organization in Nevada. So really, really intense work. One of the things I will say that maybe is a little bit different about the workforce experience, I think within social work, there is more of a desire to kind of help people figure out how to be well in their work. Because to be able to do the work that I was doing, you really had to have some of that built in. I think what they don't tell you and what they don't teach you as much in social work schools, it's definitely, it's a practice, right? It's a lifelong practice to get to that point. And there is going to be challenge. Things are not going to go to plan. Hearing people share themselves, it's such an intimate part of your experience. And I share this into sort of thinking about the workplace and where I was starting. I think I came in with the skills and the training, but the level of work that you have to do with yourself and really being able to be with yourself and be in the community. I mean, that really is a practice. And that's one of the things I've always loved and I can gravitate toward peer support around. I think there's something inherently built in to how peers think about that work and how peers really do that. So I wasn't at that time really aware of peer support, but I was becoming more aware of my own mental health issues, but still definitely not feeling like I was in a space where I could be open and honest. And I got very clear messages that that was not a good thing to be open about. I remember my supervisor telling me when I started, he said, you have to compartmentalize. When I first started here, I would go into a room and carve out time where I could just be miserable because I had to be able to compartmentalize to be able to show up for the people that I was working with. And, there's a certain reality to that. You can't walk into every session and cry hysterically, although I definitely have my moments. But that was the beginning of me sort of kind of continuing on that path of really wanting to show up as a professional as I thought I was supposed to. I moved to New York City in 1999 to finish my degree and started working again in crisis care. Was working at a community-based crisis care in Harlem, and a lot of, again, a really intense exposure and interaction with people. You really had to be prepared to respond to whoever came to the door with that, whatever issue. So that was a really great opportunity for me, again, to develop more clinical skills and to really think about more about interventions, but maybe not exploring and understanding myself as much. And what was important to me in the work that I was doing. Next slide. One of the things that I experienced, or I think a lot of folks experience, is really intense burnout. That sense that you really carried the weight of whoever walked through the door you were serving that day. And, I was also still doing work and supporting my family and supporting my brother and things that he was going through. So there was just a lot. As people have talked about, there's often a lot that what goes on in the workplace. We don't just show up in a job and become different people. We really carry those things into the workplace with us because they're a part of who we are. At some point of having done crisis care, I did decide that I really wanted to get back and start thinking about macro practices, really taken by my brother's experience, really frustrated and angry too, and wanting to do something to really shape the system in a way that I thought was more fair and more equitable. So I moved to the Urban Justice Center, and I stayed there for 13 years and was involved in a lot of policy work, advocacy, systems level work, looking a lot at the intersection of mental health and criminal justice, and also being introduced to peer support more formally. At that point, we had started to work with Howie the Harp, and they were asking peers, looking for internships, and our agency wanted to have an intern, and I didn't know a thing about peer support, which probably was not a good sign for the peers, but I believed in the value of lived experience. I believed in what I had seen in the folks I had interacted with. And so we had interns from Howie the Harp, and it was a wonderful experience to be able to have them there. And I have to say, as a supervisor, I'm very sure I learned more from them than they did from me. The way they framed things, part of the work that we would do is have them come in and work with our legal team. We were working on litigation around adult homes, and we had peers who would come and interview folks who were in adult homes, talking about their experiences as we were thinking about moving forward in impact litigation. And it was one of the most, obvious things. And we would go in and talk to residents, and they wouldn't give us a time of day. But we didn't share their experience. We didn't know what it was like to be in that space and to live there. But residents do. People who share your experience are always going to be able to connect in a way that others can't. That was really important for me. And my time at the Urban Justice Center was really, really amazing to start to look at some of the macro level issues. I think, some of the things that have come up for me, just being able to be honest about who I am and what my experience was, and work for a very progressive organization. So in a lot of ways, I think it's very different from some of the experience that Skip and Miriam talked about in the workplace, but also a different type of challenge, a very progressive, quote unquote, woke organizations. It's challenging in another way because there's an expectation about who people think you are because you show up and you walk through the door. And most of my colleagues were attorneys. I would say the majority of them went to Ivy League education. So, a completely different standard that I was comfortable with. So it wasn't like I could be a version of myself when I walked through the door, but it had to be the version of myself that was ambitious and motivated towards social change and really high achieving. And we had a work culture that was really unspoken. We didn't have a time to really show up for work, but there was an expectation that you would stay and you would work late. And everyone, it was culture, everyone worked late and everyone was sort of doing their thing and building their projects, which is really wonderful in a way. But I think like any culture, when you don't quite fit the mold, there's always that sort of pushback. And, I started to see that with some of my staff. And also, as my mental health really started to shift, I started to get that message, like, you're progressive, but we don't know. We don't know how to deal with who you're becoming now. Getting a little emotional. I didn't think that would happen, but it is. So that's where we are. I just like to just talk about that experience. It was really an important shift for me. I left there after about 13 years, and I was in the system for a while, was receiving benefits, and I had an opportunity to get back to something that I, had started doing. I was teaching, and I was at Fordham, and I knew some folks who were at Columbia in the School of Social Work, and that was another moment like, oh, there's no way I'm going to go work for an Ivy League institution and being in a School of Social Work. But I really was like, yeah, I'll interview, I'll try. And they took a chance on me, and I took a chance on them. And, I really, as much as it was difficult to go through and sort of deal with the issues around my mental health, I think, the ability to be honest was really important. And I think I also say that too, to be honest about what was right for me in a workplace, right? Sometimes I think we don't walk in feeling like we should have expectations. And that's something I always like to remind people. And you're always interviewing them. You're always trying to get a sense of how they fit into your values and who you want to be in the world. So that was really a shift for me of starting to ask some of those harder questions of where I work and who I choose to work with, and being really to get back to being a person who had expectations. And that was really a turning point for me. And I always stayed involved in the mental health and recovery world. I worked for NIAPRIS during that time and did a lot of stuff that I was really excited about. You'll see a picture down toward the right, that's Carlton and Luis Lopez and Chaku. I was doing some volunteering work as I was sort of thinking about going back into the mental health world after being in an academic setting, which I really loved. But I also really felt like I needed to be in a job where I could really see and have an impact on the things that I saw in the system in a way that felt more authentic to my lived experience. So I started volunteering. That was a conference that I'd worked on for the Office of Consumer Affairs before I started working there. And I really was able to make that transition. I started working with the office in 2014. And that's also where I also started to really get into more of the work around trauma. Again, really odd given the work that I've done. Definitely had learned about trauma. You can't finish a master's program without learning about trauma. Had extensive training. Really struggled, I think, to connect it to my personal experience and really make the connection with some of the things that happened for me. So when I was able to do that, it was really a huge, huge moment for me. And I'd known and worked with Kathy for years. And I reconnected with Kathy when she was at MHAP, and they'd gotten this grant from SAMHSA, creating a grassroots demand for trauma-informed care. And I remember when, Kathy, when you came and presented, we did a meeting with the Office Consumer Affairs. We had a quarterly meeting with peers in the community. And you were talking about the project. And I was just thinking, wow, this is a great idea. I want no part of it. I'm sort of terrified of being in this space. I don't know what it's going to be like to talk with people in this way about things that are really difficult. Again, odd given my background and the work that I've done, but there's a different level of authenticity I think that peer support brings to these conversations. I was like, I don't know if I'm quite ready for that. And so I kind of stepped into it really, really hesitant and not sure how it was going to be to be in a space where people were talking about things that really caused pain and hurt. And also is they're coming into the health department, and we're building this community. There's a lot of vulnerability. And that project lasted for several years. We ended up creating a learning community called the New York City Trauma Informed Learning Community that did a lot of wonderful work, presentations, a lot of education throughout New York City. They were able to really look and think about advocacy and what advocacy could look like, and started getting more involved in working with NIAPRIS and trying to get trauma-informed care on their legislative agenda, which they were able to do successfully. The thing that was really wonderful for me throughout that process and really that journey is just how wonderful and how healing it was, even when it was difficult. I think that's the part of trauma that people are less likely to talk about. I think one of the challenges and the struggles for me lately with this topic, Patrice, going back to your comment, we talk about trauma a lot. And we're really are talking about a lot now, but we're not talking as much about healing. We're not talking as much about the resilience that people bring. We're not talking as much about the social justice that needs to really continue to happen, because it's great to be resilient, but we want the system, we want a society that works so people don't have to constantly be resilient either. We want a just society, really trying to center and think about what that can look like. And I think a trauma-informed, responsive, a healing-centered lens really creates that window of opportunity. So it's really exciting to be able to have that experience with our learning community, and also just to see where they took that. And it's a whole nother presentation I'd love to do at some point in terms of thinking about the work. I wanted to share that just a bit about me and some of my early experience. I also wanted to transition and talk a little bit about some things that you can do in your communities, because I think that that's one of the things that's really exciting about this work is, once you understand the principles, once you understand what it means and what being in a trauma-informed and responsive environment can really mean for your well-being, you're in, and you want to find and build a community and identify resources. I know Kathy's going to talk a little bit about organizational change and organizational culture in a bit, which I think is huge. And one of the things that I've mentioned and felt really passionately about is, I think it's wonderful that we're doing this webinar and this series for peer supporters, but the system needs this. And sending peer support workers into systems that aren't well isn't going to help anyone, no matter how much we're doing to support the workforce. And I'm blown away by the level of talent and ability and empathy and just wonderful work that peers do. But sending folks into broken systems doesn't really help anyone. So it's been my feeling that this work really has to happen at every level. So, it's sort of thinking about organizational culture. I just to say that and sort of thinking about what resources and supports are really needed to move the system forward and to really make sure that people have access to information and resources. Next slide. This is the New York State Trauma Informed Network. It's now the New York State Trauma Informed Network and Resource Center. I like to start with them in terms of thinking about resource because they are a really powerful resource. And one of the things I think is really exciting and bodes well for New York State is the amount of resources and funding that the OMH has dedicated to the center. The New York State Trauma Informed Network has been in existence since 2018. It's expanded to include a resource center. They do a variety of things. The most important thing and central to their mission is really bringing together folks that identify as trauma champions, and trauma champions are really broadly defined, but they're people who at their agency and their community at whatever level have really invested and believe in this work. That's one of the things I think we found, and in peer support we talk about so much as well. There's so much strength in numbers and building community, and the network really works to try and do that by bringing people together to talk about what's happening in New York State, what resources are available for agencies, for communities. And there's some very specific things here. So there's a resource section on the website where you can go and you can register. You can find out about other people throughout the state who are doing work around trauma at the agency level, community level, also upcoming events statewide. There was a significant amount of work that happened during COVID-19. I think that was a moment the pandemic really made clear what a lot of us already knew, that people were struggling, that trauma was definitely an issue, but this global pandemic really shifted the thought into moving toward we really need to center this work, and we really need to look at the impact of circumstances like COVID-19 and what sort of supports do we need for the workforce. I think this was a really important transition and really sort of centering the workforce and acknowledging the impact that these things have on the workforce. So there's a whole section there on COVID-19 resources that you can look at as well. I mentioned a directory. There's a series of forums that also are on different topics that you can go on and just learn about anything related to trauma that you might be interested in. Some of the other things that we do is a few years ago, we started working on a training of trainers on trauma. It's definitely a trauma 101 focused. Part of the thought behind that was we really wanted to make sure that there was shared language and understanding. One of the things I think I've always really enjoyed about the trauma-informed space is that people tend to be very open to sharing different ideas and resources. And we wanted to lift that up, but also make sure that people had some basic understanding of language and terminology. For folks who may have been more involved in some of the work around trauma, it can get very, very dense. It can get into a lot of the science, and there's just a lot potentially to know. And we wanted to make sure that everyone just had some basic language and some basic training around trauma. What is it? So we developed the training of trainers. We had a cohort of about, I think, 10 people that we trained. 2 of them, I believe, were peers. We are expanding that training of trainers, and we're going to have 4 sessions throughout the year. So we'll have 4 cohorts of folks who will be able to come and be trained. And the training will be free. The only requirement that we are asking is that you'll be able to train in your organization and provide at least 2 trainings in your organization. Again, a lot of the work around the network is trying to think about how we build the infrastructure. And really training has been an important way that we've identified to start to build that infrastructure. So that is something that's an option. And we will get a follow-up. All the information on the network and everything that I'm going over will be available to you. But I want to encourage people to at least register and take a look at the website and learn more about it. We also have an advisory group that meets every other month just to talk about strategic direction for the network. Since I've been involved since 2018, it's grown significantly, but we also need more voices. We need different voices. We need people who are in the community, who are really on the ground in a way that sometimes we aren't in our positions. We're expanding. I've been working really hard to expand peer support into the network, and they're really listening to that and wanting to really prioritize that moving forward. So I think it's a really good opportunity and another way for you to get involved. The other thing that I'll mention about the network is the trust. Again, and Kathy, I know you're going to talk a little bit about organizational readiness. And one of the things that organizations often do is just some internal assessment of where you're at in your trauma-informed journey. And the trust is a tool that's free for you to use in your agencies just to get a sense of where you are as an organization. Every organization is different, and some organizations are further along and some organizations think they're further along than they really are. So this is just an opportunity to look and sort of think about your organization in a different way. And it's good to sort of so you can think and sort of tailor about, well, what do I need to get to that point where my organization is trauma informed? And you don't have to be a manager or supervisor at the organization. Anyone can use the trust. And frankly, peers or people who are coming in at different points in the organization are really important in doing some of that internal look. So the trust is available. There's also someone who can work with you. Once you do take the trust, there's someone who can provide some technical assistance if you want to think about looking at your organization and maybe thinking about how can I get organizational buy-in to think about change. And we have a little bit limited capacity for that right now, but with the extended funding, there'll be more. There's also a school-based version of the trust. So it's a little bit about the network. Next slide. And we can go past that. That's just an overview of the mission and the purpose. Another project, another initiative that the Department of Health and Mental Hygiene, Office of Consumer Affairs, and CTAC have been working on is really trying to think and get a better sense of what is happening in New York City around trauma and the goals of the collaborative. It's a quarterly meeting to bring together people in New York City who are interested in doing this work, so they're able to come together and network and get information and resources and technical assistance that that we can provide through CTAC. So we've been having that meeting, I think, for a little over a year now. And I know, Skip, you've been involved in the meeting. A lot of folks, I think I see some familiar faces. So that meeting is open, and we definitely want to encourage people to come and join us. That's, I think, a really important part of this work is connecting with other people who are doing it and really sharing your knowledge and your wisdom in the work that you do. Next slide. And Kathy, I'm going to ask you, I think I need to be the host now. So this is a project. This actually, Brittany Ellington, she presented at our last collaborative, and I just wanted to share her clip. She's doing incredible resources in Brooklyn. That's part of what we try to do through the collaborative, is really spotlight people who are doing work around trauma in the community. So I'm going to, you've made me the co-host. Just want to share a quick clip from her.
Yep, you just share your screen. There's a green button at the bottom of the screen. And when you share, make sure you click the button at the far left that says share sound.
Okay. Okay, so we're gonna see how this works for me. So is it advanced screen sharing options? Wait. Okay, let me see.
Yeah, try to click right on the screen, right on the square that says screen sharing, that green square with the arrow, try that.
Ah, success. Okay, can folks see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, so this is Brittany Ellington. This is a Crow project, and there is a curse word or two, just giving people some advance warning.
Over 60% of Americans are suffering. Flashback after flashback, I'm not bluffing. My ACE is an adverse childhood experience. Laugh now, cry later, please take this serious. This is not a joke. I'm the rose that grew from concrete. From Willoughby, East 52nd to Carroll Street. Knock me down 9 times, I get up 10. Had to finesse it 9 times out of 10. See, I was asleep, but I'm up now. And I'm busting through doors, ain't rotting on no luck now. This is really what Brooklyn sound like for real. No drilling, no gimmick, no paid hype for sale. I know too much, they love it when I'm quiet. But my brothers are fighting for their freedom, so Crown Heights, let's start a riot. Make haste, oh Lord, to deliver me. The men in my life failed me, they showed me no chivalry. I joined the gang at 11 just to fill a void. I'm healing now, but my past I just can't avoid. Adding more trauma on trauma, it got me paranoid, talking to my kids. Annoyed that I get annoyed. I'm finding new ways to cope with my aces. I hope Bezos and Jaffe don't find this tasteless. But this needed to be said because this world is so racist. Now it's more black against black. There's so much self-hatred, I can't take it. When I stopped aiming for perfect, I executed. Desperately trying to heal from my traumas, but it was rooted. You want us to heal where we got sick at? That's stupid. How the fuck you expect me to flourish where it's polluted? I wear these wounds so well and pretty. Can't help it, I'm Teflon tough, just like my city. 4'11", but think so big and she's so witty. I get up and get right to it, don't need your pity. The Crow Hill Project, AKA pain in the action for Cato. That AK bring pain when it's action. Pain in the purpose, I speak for the trauma babies. 10 out of 10 on ACEs to really make you crazy. How many more children are being silenced? Forced to keep it all in, now all they know is violence. You hush me, now I'm speaking up, and I'm not stopping till my heart stop beating up.
Crow Hill Project.
I just wanted to share, I met Brittany a while ago. I was really just blown away by her, and it really was amazing to have her come and present and share with folks in the city and the collaborative. Just a little bit about the Crow Hill Project. They are looking and focusing on ACEs and ACE scores, and really just really wanting to look at addressing ACEs through the arts. They're a new nonprofit, so they are doing some community partnership, art-based projects. They're bringing in trauma-informed yoga. So they're just a really small nonprofit. I think is doing really exciting work. And Brittany, she tells you a little bit about her story. So she came from the corporate background, and she talked about her experience of growing up, which she alluded to in her opening, and decided, I want to look at ACEs. This is important. She grew up in Crown Heights and really wanted to start that conversation there. And they've been in existence for about a year. So talk about an overachiever. So they are a small nonprofit. They're there. That's also in your packet. You'll get as a follow-up. They love they have merch. If you want to visit their website, if you're in Brooklyn, if you want to attend any of their services, any of their trauma, any of their yoga workshops, everything is free. So wanted to let people know that resource was available. Next slide. Another resource that's available, Paces Connection, people may be familiar with it. It's an online platform where people are able to log in and post, and it's a range of different things. They have different virtual categories: school-based settings, peer support, anything related to trauma and resilience that's of interest to you. It's a great site to go and get information and to gather resources. A big part of what we did with the learning community and with this process of really becoming trauma informed is learning what was in the world and getting a better sense of what other folks are doing. So it's a big part of the experience just to know what's in the world around this topic. So they're a great resource, and also you can register for free to get emails from them and to get updates. They send a lot. So be thoughtful when you sign up, and you can look at different categories based on your interest. Next slide. The other organization I wanted to mention that's also a really great resource is a Campaign for Trauma-Informed Policy and Practice. Their goal is really to help individuals, families, and communities adapt to adversity and stress, and really promoting like healthy, productive ways of doing that. Really, the CTIP is trying to build a grassroots or campaign around trauma, and a lot of it's been focused on what's happening in DC. And depending on how political you are or you aren't, that is a place where change needs to happen. If we want to see the systems that we want to see, that does need to, policy does need to play a role there. And they've been instrumental and been one of the loudest voices in DC, really pushing for trauma-informed legislation and policy reform, and also lifting up best practices and educating and Congress. They also have a strong regional presence. There is something called the CTIP CAN call, which is, I believe it's Consumer Advocacy Network. That's an open monthly meeting where they have folks from all over the country and all over the world who are doing work around trauma come in and present. And it's a really unique meeting. I'm currently on their board. Before I started and I joined their board, I actually learned about the CAN call. And I think the thing that I really appreciate about it is it's everyone under the sun that you could imagine who's coming together in this sort of virtual community. There are people like me in government who want to learn more. There were elected officials, or people who are in local communities, peer supporters, a really broad cross section of people who are interested in this work. And they're great at giving tips and strategies on advocacy, how to be involved in advocacy, even what is trauma-informed legislation, what is trauma-informed policy, really sort of creating a space where people could ask questions, and it could be really accessible for people. So I want to encourage people to always feel free to drop into that meeting. If you go to their website, you can sign up, and always open to join that meeting. It is a Zoom-based meeting. Another initiative that CTIP has worked on is called Press On. One of the founding directors of CTIP passed away recently. And this was a project that was really important to him to work with and build coalitions. There is a really robust network of trauma coalitions throughout New York State and around the country who are doing this work with different levels of engagement and collaboration. That Press On is really trying to work with the network and other partners to bring all the coalitions together, to share resources and information, and to be a really powerful block. I think we all know, there is always strength in numbers in bringing together the collective resources of different coalitions from around the country to look at this issue of trauma and what is trauma-informed legislation, what does a trauma-informed society look like, is another thing that CTIP has been really working on. And just a lot of different ideas. CTIP is really big on wanting to innovate and incubate different ideas. And you'll see a lot of things through the website, and the link to the website is at the bottom of my slide. I encourage you to just go and poke around on the website. There's a lot of really good things there. And we're also really wanting to make sure that everything is free whenever it can be. So all the resources, any sort of data, anything that we collect is always free and accessible to the public. So if there are things that you're interested in, go to our website. If you don't see something, there's probably someone who's involved with CTIP that knows something about it. And there are just folks who really want to help you on your journey in terms of moving forward with being trauma informed. So I wanted to mention that as another resource. Next slide. Oh, wow. Okay, so that is my time. Thank you so much. I'm going to turn things back over to Kathy.
Tina, thank you. Thank you for saying yes to all the things that you have said yes to. The thing that I'm most taking away from what I heard you say is that systems need this conversation. Sending peer supporters into systems that are not well doesn't help. And I so appreciate naming that in particular, because we can do all the self-care practice we want and are open to and are willing to try. But if we are constantly engaged with systems that are stuck, systems that are causing more harm, systems that are not moving forward, and really thinking about healing-centered work and how we show up for each other as employers, as organizations, as places where people connect on a regular basis, then we're not going to have the kind of systemic change that you're talking about. So I really appreciate all of that. And there's so much love in the chat for you right now. So again, thank you. So I wanted to wrap us up today thinking about, for anyone who is in a leadership role, and I also want to put some information around that. And that is, we can lead from every single seat. So we are all in leadership roles. And that there's accountability for change, that each and every one of us is capable of moving forward. And so for organizations, for programs, for folks who bring human beings together for work, is we have to be able to name that we can't do it all and we can't do it all alone. So if you're not sure, ask for help. And Tina has shared so many resources. And in this series, we have shared so many resources. And we have stories and sharing from Patrice and from Miriam and from Skip, really thinking about all the ways that all these stories matter. And Tina's story matters, and my experience matters. So the way we show up and how we show up, to make sure that those stories mean something. We're not sharing so that folks can have a side seat to our lives. We're sharing because systemic change needs to happen. And so we need ways in our organizations to do that check-in, to be able to think about and talk about and discuss ways that trauma is showing up, not just how it is impacting the folks that we serve and support, but how are staff, the folks doing the work, impacted? How do we as leaders model inclusion and openness? How do we show up in ways where we say, not only are you welcome, but we want to make sure you feel welcome, and that we're willing to look at the way we have communication, the way we are in our environments, what our spaces look like, the kinds of work that we do, but also the way that we do it. I want us to always be thinking about organizational culture and organizational climate. Our organizational culture is the way that we do things. And so Tina had mentioned in her sharing about the trust. That's an organizational assessment. we've shared, and I'll put it, it's in our resources again today, but our National Center on Domestic Violence, Trauma, and Mental Health has created an organizational self-assessment for reflection. So there are all kinds of tools and resources available where you can, as a group, as a team, share and reflect on how are we really showing up for each other? What are we doing in supervisory practice? What is our policy and practice look like? Does our policy manual even say and talk about trauma? And does it say how we will respond? We know that the antidote to trauma is connection. And so we have to be thinking about, how does every single person who works here in your space feel included and seen and heard? When we think about, again, what Tina was saying around, and Patrice as well, around trauma and how we often talk about the impacts, but there's opportunities for change. There's opportunities for action if we're willing to take it. And so to do that, we need to have a fearless look and be really willing to uncover the harms, even the ones that we are uncomfortable to talk about. And so we can all look at some obvious harms and say, yes, that's terrible. Let's not do that. But there are more subtle ways that both folks in services and getting support and folks who are doing this work are harmed all the time. And so we need to be able to uncover that and take a fearless look. Our organizational climate is what it feels like to work in a place. And so we need to ask folks, what does it feel like to work here? What's that experience? I was talking with a group of folks yesterday, and one of the participants said, I went to staff and I said, what can we do differently? And they spent 45 minutes talking about how wonderful we are. And then it got real. She said, well, I wonder what we could do if we could just get to the heart of what needs to change. She said, I appreciated that 45 minutes, but I also recognize that there were folks who were not feeling all that warmth and openness that was talked about. They weren't experiencing that warmth and openness. They were suffering and didn't feel they could bring it up. So what if we just said, yeah, we do good stuff. Let's talk about where the harms are, and let's talk about how do we shift that. So as leaders, not expecting the people who have been harmed to be in charge of the change work, but saying this is the work of all of us. Here's a commitment to this. We're going to keep communication at a very high level. We're going to talk about where we are. We're going to talk about the times where we take 2 steps forward and 3 steps back, and making it an ongoing conversation. And we won't quit when it gets hard and when it gets uncomfortable. So the change work that we need to do around healing work, healing informed work, culturally responsive work is really essential to our program. It's not just, let's talk about trauma and leave it there. It's how do we investigate? How do we embrace the change and keep it on the table, again, even when it's hard? We have to make it possible for people to practice self-care. And I loved, Tina, what you were also talking about in terms of really responding to things in a way that says, resilience is great. Naming our resilience, pointing to it is great. But what if we didn't have to tap into our resilience so much because systems were doing the right work? And that's where we need to be, is that systems are doing the right work. It's not our differences that divide us. It's in our inability to recognize, accept, and celebrate those differences. And so I think about all of this in response to the stories we've shared in this series, the stories that were shared today, and the call to action for change. These are some of the resources that we've mentioned. And again, you have access to all of the resources that Tina has mentioned today. and to really think about ways that you can get involved, get engaged, champion change, and make the world a really different place. I'm going to share our contact information and also invite Rita to close us out.
Thank you so much, Kathy, and thank you to all of our presenters for today. Our partnership with Patrice, with the New York City Peer and Community Health Worker Workforce Consortium. We're in partnership with the Academy of Peer Services. So on behalf of the Academy of Peer Services, I want to thank Patrice for her partnership. I want to thank Kathy and her work with the National Center for Domestic Violence and Mental Health. She's brought so many resources to this and so much wisdom in her many years of doing this work. So thank you, Kathy. Mariam Hussamadeen, who is my partner in crime at the Academy of Peer Services. She actually works for NIAPers. She shared some of her story today. And Mariam, you are no longer visible. You're very visible now. Skip, I love, you are so inspirational every time you speak. And I just love that you brought so much to the awareness about what kinds of trauma people with justice involvement go through and what's really necessary to work for them to work well in the workforce. Tina, amazing sharing. Thank you so much. And I also want to give a big shout out to Laverne Miller, who has been behind the scenes and really bringing the spirit of all of this alive for us. So Laverne, thank you for being here. I'm Rita Cronise. I'm with the Academy of Peer Services. And I just wanted to mention that this session has been recorded. All 3 of the sessions are recorded and are going to be posted on the virtual learning community, which I'll send a follow-up email. You'll get the links to all of that shortly. And these will be turned into courses into the Academy of Peer Services over the summer. So thank you, everyone. Really appreciate you being here.